If Washington needed an exit and Tehran needed an exit, somebody needed to build that exit. And increasingly, the country doing the building is one that rarely gets credit for this kind of work: Pakistan. Retired Pakistani Major General Zaid Mahmood offered a description of this moment that cuts through a lot of the noise. Despite the tit-for-tat military attacks, despite the closure of Hormuz, despite the strikes, despite the deaths, both the US and Iran, he argued, are looking for a way to end this. Tehran, he said, is under tremendous economic pressure. Washington faces political pressure in a war that's become deeply unpopular at home. His framing was almost mechanical in a useful way. You can't keep Hormuz blocked for much longer like this, he said. Both sides, he argued, must create incentives for each other and take this opportunity, this off-ramp that Pakistan has provided them. An off-ramp, not a destination, not a resolution, an off-ramp, a way to exit the highway of escalation without either side having to admit defeat. And this is, in many ways, the unglamorous reality of how most wars actually end. Not with surrender ceremonies and unconditional terms, but with mediators. Qatar, Pakistan in this case, quietly constructing a face-saving exit that both sides can walk through while claiming to their own populations that they got what they needed. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed this dynamic directly. Qatar and Pakistan, Baghai said, are actively engaging in mediation efforts. But, and this caveat keeps appearing, recent US actions have affected the diplomatic process. Even as the off-ramp was being built, the traffic on the highway hadn't stopped. Now, let's get into the substance, because there are, remarkably, at least 3 different versions of what this Memorandum of Understanding actually contains, depending on who's describing it. Version 1, Trump's version. Trump described it as a very strong and detailed Memorandum of Understanding, backed, he said, by many countries with great influence over Iran. He said the deal is great for the US, great for the Middle East, and ultimately great for Iran too, because in his words, it'll let them build up their country. On the nuclear question specifically, Trump was unambiguous. They will not have a nuclear weapon. They have agreed to that. No purchasing, no development in any way, shape, or form. He also confirmed something significant. Once signed, the threat to invade Karg Island would be off the table, permanently, not just for now. And the US blockade on Iranian ports would lift immediately, which Trump predicted would send oil prices dropping like a rock. Version 2, Netanyahu's version, relayed through his office. Israel is not a party to this MOU, but Netanyahu's office released a readout describing what Trump committed to in terms that go considerably further than Trump's own public comments. The removal of Iran's enriched uranium, the dismantling of enrichment infrastructure, limitations on missile production, and the cessation of Iran's support for regional proxies, missile production limits, proxy support cessation. These are massive commitments. Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq and Syria, and yet Trump in his own public remarks has barely touched on any of it. Version 3, Iran's version. Iran's foreign ministry has been the most consistent and the most cautious. Bahani confirmed Iran had agreed to much of the draft text, but said the US had repeatedly shifted its position. He emphasized that Tehran remains firm on its red lines, and critically, no final decision has been made. Once Iran's relevant authorities reach a conclusion, the government, not Trump, not anyone else, will make the formal announcement. Let's spend a moment on what might be the most consequential relationship in this entire conflict, because everything else, in some sense, runs through it. Matthew Croning, Vice President for Geostrategy at the Atlantic Council, offered a framing that helps explain the tensions we've seen throughout this war. From the very start, he argued, Israel and the US had different objectives. When the military operation began, Israel, in Croning's assessment, was after something close to regime collapse in Iran. The US, meanwhile, had more limited goals, degrading Iran's military capabilities and stopping the nuclear program specifically. Those differences, he said, were always there. Now we see them coming out. But Croning's ultimate conclusion was telling. Despite these divergent goals, the president is ultimately right when he says he calls the shots. For an Israeli leader, he argued, Maintaining a good relationship with Washington is one of the most important strategic priorities there is. So, in his assessment, Netanyahu is not going to stray too far from what Washington wants. Joel Rubin, a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, offered a similar but more textured read. Yes, he acknowledged, there's a growing rift. Trump reportedly told the Israelis not to bomb Lebanon, and Netanyahu ignored that essentially. There's been, in Rubin's words, this public back and forth, but Rubin cautioned against reading too much into it. He compared Trump's handling of Netanyahu to how Trump treats a Senate Majority Leader or House Speaker from his own party when he's unhappy. He tells them so, publicly sometimes, but he isn't going to break the relationship. The U.S., Rubin emphasized, is still coordinating with the Israeli military and intelligence apparatus. The friction is real. The alliance is not in jeopardy. While all of this diplomatic drama unfolded, the MOU, the canceled strikes, the Hormuz closure, the phone calls between Trump and the Qatari emir, two other conflicts, adjacent to but distinct from the US-Iran confrontation, continued without pause. In Lebanon, Israel launched new strikes in Nabatea, Tyre, and Bint Jbeil. One strike on a hospital in Tyre injured 10 staff members. Israel's military also claimed to have seized operational control of the area north of Lebanon's Wadi Saluki stream, just 10 kilometers from the Israeli border. This is the kind of incremental, on-the-ground territorial consolidation that doesn't depend on what happens in Washington or Tehran. It has its own logic, its own timeline, its own momentum. And in the occupied West Bank, the United Nations released numbers this week that in any other news cycle would themselves be the headline. Settler attacks causing casualties or property damage in the West Bank have now surpassed 1,000 this year. These attacks have affected more than 230 communities across every part of the territory. More than 2,200 Palestinians have been displaced this year due to settler violence or access restrictions, and that's on top of hundreds more displaced by home demolitions. Separately, Haaretz reported that the Israeli army is establishing its first permanent military base inside Jenin, the first such installation in an area under full Palestinian Authority civil and security control since the 1993 Oslo Accords. Sources told the outlet the base is likely intended to help protect nearby Israeli settlements. We touched on the World Bank's warning in our last episode, but the full report, published this week, deserves a closer look because the numbers paint a picture that's almost staggeringly comprehensive. Global growth for 2026 cut to 2.5%, down from a January forecast of 2.9%. That's the slowest pace since the COVID-19 pandemic. Brent crude, the international benchmark, is now projected to average $94 a barrel this year. That's 36% above last year's average. Fertilizer prices forecast to rise significantly, with direct knock-on effects for food prices everywhere, including countries thousands of miles from the Gulf. Global inflation projected to hit 4% this year, up from 3.3% last year. And the worst-case scenario, if energy disruptions worsen further, global growth could fall to 1.3%, with inflation pushing to 4.4%. The World Bank downgraded growth forecasts for two-thirds of all countries it tracks since January. Two-thirds, because of one regional conflict. World Bank Group President Ajay Banga summarized the institution's position with a line that's almost deceptively simple. The impact differs by country, but the basic test is the same. Protect people and preserve stability today without giving up on growth and jobs tomorrow. And then there's this, the part of the report that reveals just how seriously the World Bank is taking this. The organization has set aside up to $60 billion to help developing countries cope with the economic fallout of this conflict. And if the conflict persists, if this MOU collapses, if the off-ramp isn't taken, that figure could rise to $100 billion. As we close in on the present moment, there's one voice that offered perhaps the most important framing of this entire situation, and it came from someone with direct experience of exactly this kind of process. Retired U.S. Army General Mark Kimmitt put it plainly. We've got to recognize this is not the deal. This is just the MOU needed to end the current conflict. This MOU, he explained, will stop the conflict. It will open the Strait of Hormuz. It represents, in his words, a down payment on further negotiations. But, he added, we're nowhere near hitting the details or hard parts. Let's go back to where we started. Somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, the wreckage of what happened to the Seti Bello and the families of 3 Indian sailors who won't be coming home represent something that no memorandum, no signing ceremony, no diplomatic phone call can undo. And somewhere off the coast of Sarik, an Iranian fisherman who lost his boat but kept his life is presumably trying to figure out what comes next. For him, for his livelihood, in a region where even fishing has become an act of geopolitical risk. These are the textures underneath the headlines. The "we ended the war" and the "merely speculation" and the "very strong memorandum of understanding." Behind every one of those phrases are people, sailors, fishermen, hospital staff in Tyre, families in Jenin, soldiers on both sides, whose lives have been reorganized around a conflict most of them have no power to influence. So what does the future hold? If General Kimmitt is right, and history suggests he probably is, then what we're looking at is not an ending, but a transition. The shooting may stop, the strait may reopen, oil prices may, as Trump predicted, start dropping like a rock. But the hard parts? Iran's missile capabilities, its proxy networks, the territorial realities in Lebanon, the ongoing crisis in the West Bank, the trust deficit between Washington and Tehran that's been rebuilt and shattered more times in the past few weeks than most relationships experience in years, none of that disappears because of a signing ceremony in Europe. What disappears, if we're lucky, is the immediate danger. The danger of a Hormuz closure that starves the global economy. The danger of a strike on Karg Island that drags every Gulf state into direct confrontation. The danger of the next intercepted missile becoming the one that isn't intercepted. That's not nothing. After everything we've covered across this series, the suspended talks, the downed Apache, the ended the war announcement that Iran called speculation, and now the closure of Hormuz followed by its apparent reopening, de-escalation, even partial, even fragile, even just a down payment, is worth taking seriously. But it's also worth remembering what got us here in the first place. This isn't the first ceasefire. It isn't the first deal. And the forces that broke the previous ones, the hardliners in Tehran who view any agreement as betrayal, the divergent goals between Washington and Jerusalem, the economic desperation that makes populations volatile, the proxy networks that operate on their own logic regardless of what capitals decide.
None of those forces have gone anywhere. If this series has helped you follow one of the most complex, fast-moving conflicts in recent memory, subscribe so you don't miss what happens this weekend. Share this with someone trying to understand why oil prices keep swinging wildly. And tell me in the comments, do you think this MOU actually holds? Or are we back here in 2 weeks? Stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.